This is a forum on the impacts of climate change, sponsored by the Safe Climate Caucus. And we are pleased to have with us several members of the Safe Climate Caucus, Congressman Jim Moran and Congressman Earl Blumenauer, and others will be coming as well. Earlier this year, we established the Safe Climate Caucus to end what we see as a conspiracy of silence in the House of Representatives about the dangers and impacts of climate change. And we've committed as a caucus to have somebody on the House floor talk about the urgent need to address climate change every single day. I'm pleased that several members are with us, and I'm going to recognize them to make some comments before we hear from our witnesses. But I want to thank all the people on our panel for being here at this important forum. Your voices and your stories are ones that Congress urgently needs to hear. The world's leading scientists agree climate change is occurring, is primarily caused by human activities, and threatens the world we live in. Climate scientists also agree that warming temperatures will contribute to more frequent and intense extreme weather events and wildfires, and they say that these trends will worsen as temperatures rise. Many scientists also tell us that the signs of climate change are already clearly starting. Boulder County, Colorado, is suffering massive floods after receiving more than a half year's worth of rain in just 3 days. Other parts of the country continue to suffer from extreme drought. The rim fire near Yosemite in California has become one of the largest in the state's history, and no one can forget the devastation of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy just last year. These natural disasters impose harsh personal and economic costs. People lose their lives, families lose their homes, businesses suffer. We spend billions of dollars to respond to each disaster and rebuild in the aftermath. Unfortunately, many members of Congress continue to deny that climate change is even happening. Even members who represent areas hard hit by extreme drought or unprecedented floods or massive wildfires often act and vote as if nothing unusual is happening. And in fact, there are even members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee with the jurisdiction over energy policy, who argue that there have been no adverse impacts from climate change in the United States. They don't believe in the science, and they don't even want to call forward and hear from the scientists about these evidence and the conclusions that many are reaching from the evidence. But that's why we invited you here today. Your experiences are proof that climate change does have consequences. Congress needs to hear from you and hear from you and have you explain how a rapidly changing climate can exact a tremendous toll on communities throughout this country. Remarkably, this is the first time that individuals like you have come before the Congress to tell your stories, but it should be not the last time. Every member needs to hear from his or her constituents about the costs of inaction and the dangers of ignoring the science. So I look forward to your testimony today and learning from you, and I thank you for having the courage to come here and share your experiences with us. I'd like to now yield some time to Congressman Jim Moran, who's the chairman of the subcommittee. No, he's the ranking member of the subcommittee in the Appropriations Committee that has jurisdiction over energy and environmental policy. Mr. Rand.
Thank you very much, Chairman Waxman, and thank you for your constant, determined, consistent leadership on this issue. Now, while I'm very proud to be a member of the Safe Climate Caucus, I do think that Earl and I should suggest that you are also required to be a member of the Beard Caucus. And while this mustache is becoming, it's insufficient because Earl and I have advanced beyond that. But beyond that, I'll get into somewhat more substantive substance here because this is very serious and it's nothing to joke around about. Unfortunately, the majority of the Congress are not taking it seriously, and I'm afraid an insufficient number of the American people are not taking climate change sufficiently serious. I was reading the article in The Guardian, which was a terrific article. I commend it to anybody who cares about this issue. It references the fact that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was issued a report which was prepared by 2,000 climate scientists, and it estimates that the world is going to go past the 2 degrees Celsius target of increase in temperature with about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. It says this is the reddest of red lines for human existence on the planet. We don't take it seriously, but it's extraordinarily serious. Our observatory at Mauna Loa in Hawaii has recognized we're now at 400 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the last time we were at that stage was about 3 million years ago, and during the Pliocene period when sea levels were 75 feet higher than they are now. Clearly, the frequency and severity of extreme weather events like Hurricane Sandy and wildfires in the West and flooding in the Philippines and Pakistan are related to this global warming. There was a very interesting article when we've been so transfixed on what's going on in Syria, and understandably so, but there's a very interesting article in terms of the core cause of the conflict, and a lot of it had to do with the economy, which has suffered so much because of the drought. As we see flooding displacing communities and droughts displacing economies, you're going to see more and more chaos and destructive conflict among peoples who are struggling to survive. And invariably, the climate change plays a role. And it's a result of decisions that the human species on this planet are making individually and collectively not to take this subject sufficiently seriously. Now, not that it's acceptable, but I guess it's a little more explainable, understandable why the Congress isn't dealing with it adequately, because the Congress received last year more than $34 million from extraction industries, principally oil, gas, and coal companies, who basically paid a whole lot of members to vote against doing anything on climate change. And on the appropriations bill that Henry referenced, we had 31 legislative riders on that bill, all of which were designed to deregulate or to prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating with the authority of the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. In other words, to disregard the impact of climate change on our environment, on our economy, and on our society. The extraction industries are getting what they're paying for. This has been the most irresponsible Congress in terms of the magnitude of the crisis that we face. We're looking the other way. We're trying to pretend it doesn't happen, or lying with regard to the information that is certainly available to every member. So this is where we are, and let me get back to where I started. Henry, thank you for your leadership and that of my good friend Earl Blumenauer and some other members of the Congress for continuing to remind our colleagues and the country that this is a very serious issue, and even though it's not at the top of the polls, if we don't act now, all of our children and grandchildren are going to suffer as a result. So again, we thank you for attending this hearing, and thank you, Henry. And I'm anxious to, I'm proud to be sitting alongside our friend Earl, and anxious to hear from him. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Mr. Blumenauer from the state of Oregon.
Thank you. And I agree with my colleague, Mr. Moran, in expressing appreciation for your continued focus and leadership. Mr. Waxman, it matters. I take modest exception with just one thing that Jim said in terms of whether or not this is in the focus of the public and that isn't reflected in the polls. I think the issue is how we ask the question and what people are concerned about. And I think the stories we're going to hear today are ones that do matter to people. It's interesting that you face a Congress that is completely paralyzed in terms of dealing with fiscal issues. Well, disaster costs were $400 per family last year. We started this year with a lot of arm wrestling about a tax deal that was supposed to raise $600 billion over the next 10 years. And people were patting themselves on the back having accomplished that. Hurricane Sandy cost the entire first year of this massive tax increase. Just $160 billion. It's frustrating that it is extraordinarily hard to do the right thing just in terms of prevention, which we know if we just take some steps, it will save about $4 for every dollar that we invest. But at the end of the day, it isn't about disaster, although I note with some amount of irony, when you were finally able to persuade the Republicans on the Commerce Committee to have a hearing, they didn't invite FEMA, which is bearing the brunt of this. But in the final analysis, it's what we have to do dealing with carbon pollution and extreme weather events, things that are in fact within our capacity to at least moderate. The Congress is sleepwalking. I can't say how much I appreciate your inviting our guests to make this a part of the record and moving forward, because what's going to wake up Congress ultimately is going to be the stories that we're hearing today to tie to what our families care about, business, local government, and I think we can wake up Congress by motivating our fellow citizens with stories like yours. I feel very bad because I have another meeting that is scheduled. I have two of my colleagues here, Janine Benner, with whom I've been arm wrestling issues of flood, disaster, climate for longer than she cares to remember, Tyler Frisbee, who will be monitoring. We will take this information and try and use it, and deeply, deeply appreciate your investment with us today. Don't give up on the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tomorrow, Mr. Blumenauer referred to a hearing. Tomorrow there will be a hearing, I don't know if it's in this room or in another committee room for the Energy and Commerce Committee, but the Republicans who have called the hearing have called in the people from the administration to ask what they're doing about this climate change, what regulations are they proposing, and how that's going to hurt, because their argument is that we should have no regulation at all, since they're not hearing from you today to know why we need to respond to this climate crisis. Our panelist today, Matt Russell, is a fifth-generation farmer from Lacona, Iowa. He's had to cope with several extreme weather events in recent years, including unseasonably hot and cold temperatures, historic drought, and flooding. Emily Dondero lives in Sonora, California. Her community is currently suffering the effects of a massive wildfire that has led to evacuations, the closings of schools and businesses, and degraded air quality. Hugh Fitzsimmons is a bison rancher and beekeeper in Carrizo Springs, Texas. The drought of 2011 forced him to shrink his bison herd and dramatically reduce his honey production. Stephanie Kravitz lives in Long Beach, New York, a city on a barrier island on the Atlantic Ocean that suffered some of the worst devastation from Hurricane Sandy. Her family's home was flooded and damaged, destroying repairs they had made in the aftermath of Hurricane Irene. Reverend Tyrone Edwards is a native of Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Reverend Edwards is the founder and executive director of the Zion Traveler Cooperative Center, which he organized in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita to help rebuild his damaged community. And Dr. Noah Diffenbaugh is an assistant professor in the School of Earth Sciences and center fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. Dr. Diffenbaugh is currently a lead author for Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is focused on assessing the impacts of climate change on human beings and the environment. We thank each of you for being here. We'd like to hear from you in no more than 5 minutes, and then we'd like to ask questions. Members, unfortunately, have schedules here that will require them to be elsewhere, as Mr. Blumenauer has explained, and others will be joining us. I will be here throughout. Mr. Russell, there's a microphone. If you would turn on the button on the base and pull it close to you.
Good morning, and thank you, Representative Waxman and other members of the Safe Climate Caucus, for the opportunity to be here today to share my experiences of climate change on my farm. And I'm Matt Russell, and as mentioned, I'm a fifth-generation Iowa farmer. I've been involved in agriculture my entire life, starting with my parents' farm in southwest Iowa, then building a career advocating and educating for agriculture, and buying my own farm in 2005 that I co-own and operate with my spouse. Here's a quick history of what climate change looks like in Iowa. We had historical flooding in 2008. That was the 500-year flood. And again in 2010, we had another series of 100-year floods. Then in 2011, the Missouri River wiped out thousands of acres of very productive farmland, just wiped it off the map. And some of that will never be farmed again. And then, shifting gears, last year, we had the catastrophic drought of 2012. So in half a decade, Iowa saw some of the worst flooding and the worst drought in recorded history. Climate scientists have told us this is what climate change will look like, and it's going to get worse and more severe and extreme. And so we have 2013. Let me share with you what life has been like on our farm. The first record we set was on May 4th with a snowstorm. It was the worst blizzard on our farm in 2 years. We had a foot of heavy, wet snow. We lost power for 36 hours. We had to put hay out for the cattle. This is in May. We had to put hay out for the cattle. We had to run a generator to keep the tomatoes alive in a building that is a cold frame building. We don't heat it, but we had to heat it to keep the tomato seedlings alive May 4th. It started snowing on the 3rd, and as I was walking out to check on some cattle through 4 inches of snow, I could hear the frogs. And I remember thinking, this is really strange. I suppose someplace in the world there are frogs and snow, but not in Iowa. This is one of the things climate change means, the wrong weather at the wrong time. In other words, this blizzard, resulting in the most snow ever recorded in the month of May in Iowa. Then it set to raining, the most rain ever recorded in the month of May in Iowa. Then it shut off completely, and we're back into drought. Last month was one of the driest Augusts on record, including drier than last year during the epic drought. I almost forgot, July was the coldest month, the coldest July ever recorded in Iowa. We had temperatures in some parts of the state in the 30s. The lows were in the 30s. And now we're experiencing the hottest September Iowa has recorded on record. The hottest days in Iowa have come after Labor Day with several days of 100-degree temperatures. So the joke around Iowa is, since February came in May, and with all of the rain for the summer, and September came in July, and July came in September, what month's going to show up in October? But it isn't a joke if you're trying to farm. It isn't a joke when taxpayers are picking up some of the cost of the crop insurance bill. In 2012, Iowa farms were paid $2 billion in crop insurance indemnities. It isn't a joke when markets swing as wildly as the weather. It isn't a joke when a farmer watches his precious soils wash away overnight in an 11-inch rain event, or when wells run empty and ponds go dry. There are still people who deny climate change, and some of the loudest voices of denial have come from the agricultural community. And there may still be some farmers out there who are denying climate change, but let me tell you, none of us are ignoring it. We're putting in tile like crazy to deal with more extreme rainfall events. Contractors putting in ponds and digging deeper wells can't keep up with the demand as farmers deal with repeated and longer-lasting droughts. Farmers are buying more crop insurance to deal with the extreme weather and more frequent crop losses. Livestock producers are downsizing or completely liquidating because they can't find affordable feed. In Iowa, we had nearly 800,000 acres that were not planted, prevented planting in the spring. And now we have places in the state that are going to get about a third of a crop of soybeans because of the drought. And what's interesting is that the acres not planted because of the flood and the acres having extreme yield reductions because of the drought are right next to each other. It's not like one part of the state, they're right next to each other. Climate change is real, it's happening, it's getting worse, and it's already causing great harm to farms like my own. But American farms aren't just victims here. We can be part of the solution. The answer is uncomplicated, although not easy. We need to stop putting carbon in the atmosphere, and we need to start pulling it out of the atmosphere, putting it into the ground, and farmers like myself can help do that. This is something American farmers can do. On our farm, we put land into productive forages. Other farmers are getting really wild and crazy about cover crops. We're starting to think about ways to do it. We can't choose whether or not to deal with the consequences of the droughts and the floods, but we can choose to be a part of the solution. And I speak for a lot of farmers when I say, let's stop wasting our time debating whether climate change exists. We need to use our time and money to find ways to protect the climate that American agriculture depends on. Time and again, American agriculture has led the world in solving really big problems. And it's time that farmers put their shoulders to the wheel and help solve this one.
Thank you. Very well said. Ms. Dondera?
Okay, I'll move this towards. How's that? Is that okay?
Good,
okay.
thank you.
My name's, hello, thanks for having me here. I'm glad to be here to represent California and our current wildfire in the Yosemite area. So my name's Emily Dondero. I'm from Sonora. Sonora is a small town in Tuolumne County, California. Sonora is a gateway town to the Stanislaus National Forest and is one of the closest towns to Yosemite National Park. My town, county, the Stanislaus National Forest, and Yosemite National Park were greatly impacted by the Rim Fire. As I stand here today, the Rim Fire it continues to burn. The fire started more than 4 weeks ago, but in the town of Sonora, we're still impacted by smoke, and we still see a big cloud of smoke in the sky. Currently, 400 square miles, more than 255,000 acres, have burned. This is an area more than 6 times the size of the District of Columbia. I grew up in the central Sierra Nevada. People from this region realize fires are a part of life, as with earthquakes and hurricanes in other regions. But the Rim Fire is exceptional. It is the biggest fire in this region that I've experienced in my lifetime. It's the 3rd largest fire in California's recorded history and the largest ever in the Sierra Nevada. The fire is 84% contained, and this is a number that I had to just update this morning because it continues to change. And this is a number that I've also had to change because this goes up daily. The cost to battle this fire has reached $113 million over the past 4 weeks. There's been a tremendous response to battle the fire. More than 5,000 firefighters from 48 states were fighting at one point. Many of the firefighters that continue to battle the fire are my neighbors, my friends, and my family. The area of the Rim Fire took place in the watershed and forests that sustain our rural economy in Tuolumne County. My friends, family, and community use the rivers for rafting and swimming. We use the forests for hiking, to graze cattle, and to support our local timber industry. We have suffered many losses. The fire caused the displacement of wildlife. We lost the timber that would have brought economic prosperity to our town. We lost the trees that could have generated electricity via a biomass facility. The rim fire also put old groves of giant trees at risk, some of which are over 3,000 years old. Moreover, the Stanislaus Forest and Yosemite National Park contain a series of reservoirs and dams that provide the main water and power supplies for the city of San Francisco and more than 2.4 million people in the Bay Area. During the rim fire, San Francisco turned this energy supply off, buying energy from the market, and at one point there was a concern about possible contamination of the San Francisco's drinking water, and will continue to be an issue as we move into the rain season and worry about sediment and flow into the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. At a community level, smoke and flames from the fire forced the evacuations of hundreds of homes and closed schools and businesses in Tuolumne County for weeks. Smoke from the rim fire also caused the cancellation of annual events that our communities rely on for our local economy, and led tens of thousands of visitors to cancel planned vacations and trips. The poor air quality impacted communities hundreds of miles away across the western United States. During the first week of the fire, I dropped my sister-in-law off at college in Nevada, Reno, which is a state away. But the smoke from the rim fire in Reno was so bad that many of her first college activities were canceled. All of this together, the magnitude of the damage, the extent of the smoke, the community and personal impacts, the risk to San Francisco's energy and water supply, served to remind us all how connected we really are. John Muir, ironically, says it best: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. The rim fire illustrates the severity of fires that scientific experts anticipate will become more common as a result of climate change. Experts say this is just a preview of major fires to come across the United States, as altered forest ecology due to hotter and drier conditions result in larger, more destructive, and more intense fires. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent to put out the rim fire, and unfortunately the cost will continue due to the loss of businesses, water storage capacity issues, loss of hydropower production, and restoration costs. But there is good news, I feel, that there is opportunities where money can be spent up front so that we are prepared for the drier and hotter conditions that create fires the size of the rim fire. We have the opportunity to enhance our forest management and invest in upper watershed care, which would help protect us from future climate disasters, while improving local economies, creating jobs, generating renewable energy, and ensuring clean drinking water for millions of Americans. It is my hope that my voice today has inspired the sense of urgency needed so that we can work together to protect our communities, forests, and watersheds against the threat of climate change. Thanks for hearing my story.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. Very powerful. Mr. Fitzsimmons, if you'll pull one of the mics over to you. I think that one there. And be sure the button is pushed on the base.
How's that? Great, thank you. My name is Hugh Fitzsimmons. I ranch in Dimmitt County, Texas, 150 miles southwest of San Antonio and 9 miles east of the Rio Grande River. We are dead on the 100th meridian, the historic dividing line between wet and dry. The Spanish maps from the early 18th century labeled this country the Despoblado, no man's land. No one wanted it, save for the native Cahuiltecans, who fit with the land forever on the edge of drought. It's long been a land of environmental extremes, feast or famine, but a reckoning now seems at hand. My grandfather bought the ranch in 1932 for two things a cattleman needs: abundant native grasses and good, clean underground water. He came to it after roping wild steers on the prairies and river bottoms of Gonzales County, Texas. But he had an itch to get rich. So in 1901, he hung up his rope to head for Texas's thriving oil field, Spindletop. That oil field ushered in the internal combustion engine. By the 1930s, tired of the oil business, grandfather started life anew. For 25 years, he raised registered Hereford and Angus cattle and summered steers in the Flint Hills of Kansas, selling them grass fat to the U.S. Army. But in 1951, we began what has been called the Drought of Record, a 7-year stretch without moisture. One day on the front porch of the bunkhouse, my grandfather declared, I'm leaving this ranch, and I'm not coming back till it rains. He never came back, and we had no significant rain for another 3 years. For the next 30 years, my father ran a Hereford and red Brahma cow-calf operation and leased land for hunting and for exploration of oil and gas. After a career teaching Texas history, I moved back to the ranch 15 years ago in 1998 to work with nature, not against her. I settled on 2 avenues of production. For the first, I chose the American buffalo, or bison, an indigenous animal with the means to survive. Here was a low-maintenance, self-sustaining herbivore whose 10,000-year evolution prepared it for what climate change was sending my way. For the second, I chose honey. I contracted with beekeepers to harvest the native nectar of our wahillo bush. All that was required was water, bees, and the wahillo blooms. In a normal year, we will make 50 to 100 pounds per colony of bees. 13 years ago, in 2000, things changed. Less rainfall, milder winters, and blazing hot summers. The wake-up call came in 2011, the worst single drought year in Texas history. We had plummeting water wells, the desiccation of our rivers and surface water, and a punishing summer of over 100 degrees for 3 solid months. The bison were getting worried. The bees were starving to death. By April of last year, when we should have seen 70 to 100 baby bison calves nursing at their mother's side, we had a grand total of 7. It was so dry the female bison would not go into estrus. I had to cull over 2/3 of the herd. We burned pear for the remainder, and the remaining bison ate mesquite beans produced by the mesquite tree from July to September. And while a normal honey crop for me is around 75 barrels, by this spring I had made a grand total of 2. The fall without rain last year dried up the moisture the wahillo needed to set a bloom, something no regional beekeeper had ever seen. There is always at least some bloom, but not now. At the same time, one of the largest oil and gas plays in the world has landed in Dimmitt County, our home county. Fracking in the Eagle Ford Shale has wrought more change in 2 years than the past 200. Our tax revenue, population, and public school enrollment are surging like a runaway 18-wheeler. Oil and gas production are up 134% over a year ago. Most of the oil workers are imports from East Texas. The price of a rental house is now out of reach for most citizens of Dimmitt County. But the hard facts are these. 1/3 of our available groundwater in Dimmitt County per year is being lost to fracking. Because the water used to inject the chemicals is absorbed by the formation, this process is 100% consumptive. Unless the 20% that returns as flowback water is recycled, all that water is lost. Unlike agricultural irrigation, fracking wastewater is lost completely. In short, we have a new man-made water crisis etched atop the man-made crisis of climate change that produced the drought. For years, our normal rainfall was around 21 inches. Our hydrologist tells me that unless we get between 15 to 17 inches of rain a year, there is no recharge. So we are now using up 1/3 of our groundwater a year when we've had virtually no recharge for 3 years. We're running on empty. The forecast under climate change is for 12 to 15 inches of rain a year in our area. In short, our water is being drained to produce the oil and gas that have produced the worldwide climate crisis. There are moments in life that turn you. Mine came in the spring a year ago when I flipped on the irrigation switch from my pump and got half the water I'd been producing before. From my irrigation pump, I could see no fewer than 4 drilling rigs, each of them sucking 3 to 5 million gallons of fresh water per frac. My fresh water is being drained, and there seems to be nothing I could do about it. My anger made me want to run for office as the director of the Winter Garden Water Conservation District. Somehow I prevailed, and I started to learn water law, rule of capture, and how to start the energy companies conserving water. The problem is, in our district, oil and gas are exempt from the permitting process. In other words, we, the designated water authorities, are nearly powerless to conserve and protect the water on which all of life depends. Dimmitt County, as you may have gathered, has never been well off. Now we face two new threats. First, the vacuuming up of our water for fracking and removing it from the hydrologic cycle. The second threat is just as serious. Because the riches of oil and gas production are falling like manna from heaven, no one wants to talk about water, least of all state regulators, even if our water is disappearing. To explain, in order to dispose of toxic wastewater from fracking, wells are injected deep into the earth. If the wells are correctly constructed and in the right geologic formation, they're reasonably safe. The problem is there are from 10,000 to 100,000 abandoned oil and gas wells in the state, and Texas regulators have no idea where and how many there are. But if an injection well for fracking wastewater is drilled near an abandoned old well and its well casing or cement job gives way, toxic waste from the disposal can migrate to the old well, flow up the pipe, and contaminate the groundwater. Our water district has made protesting these injection wells a top priority. But when I last appeared this summer before the state regulators at the Railroad Commission, they didn't want to hear about it. The examiner and judge labeled our hydrologist questions hearsay, and my invoking those questions was stricken from the record. In other words, denial is not just a river in Egypt. It was one thing to have the disposal well company ignore our questions. When the judge declared the disposal well company didn't have to answer our questions because the law didn't require it, it became clear that the denial in our state is as deep as the injection wells. One subject I feel fairly comfortable with is Texas history. From that history, it's clear the oil business is here to stay. For the time being, so am I. What we need is hydrocarbon extraction under responsible rules and regulation that protect our vanishing groundwater. Without it, over-extraction will become the epitaph of the American West. As the poet Gary Snyder once said, just remember, nature bats last. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzsimmons.
Good statement.
Very good.
We're going from
Ms.
drought.
Kravitz?
We're going from drought to floods. My name is Stephanie Kravitz. I live in Long Beach, New York, a barrier island just south of Long Island. When my husband Stuart and I moved to Long Beach in 2009, we had an engineer survey our house, and he found no visible sign of water. We live in an area called the Canals on the Bay side. Many of our neighbors have lived in Long Beach most of their lives and love living in the canals, but that was before we met our two least favorite women, Irene and Sandy. My husband is a weather junkie and watches the Weather Channel like a show. He checks the National Hurricane Center website every day. In 2011, we knew Irene was going to hit Long Beach. We prepared our house as well as we could. My husband wanted to stay to try to save our house. I was crying and persuaded him to evacuate. We were one of the few homes in our area that flooded in Irene. The storm hit on August 28th. We finished repairing our home and replacing all the mechanicals on December 20th. It was a very stressful time. Once Halloween was approaching last year, we thought we had made it through hurricane season. We were wrong. When the Sandy report started, we reversed roles. I wanted to stay to prevent damage, and Stuart convinced me to leave. Our neighbors invited us to a barbecue as if nothing were going to happen. We moved all three of our cars off the island and evacuated. The last text message I got was our next-door neighbor saying our first floor is flooded and our front deck washed away. As soon as we could, we drove home. The devastation that we saw that day is hard to describe. Boats and cars were thrown around like they were toys, roofs torn off of homes and buildings, and glass shattered everywhere. The storm surge swept through the city, and the ocean met the bay. 35,000 people live in Long Beach. 9,500 homes were damaged, and the City Building Commission estimates 25% of all homes are still vacant almost 1 year later. We were no longer one of a few, we were one of thousands. Our basement flooded to the ceiling, and our first floor flooded 4 feet. Our neighbors who stayed were not only traumatized by the flood, but during the height of the storm, 10 homes around the corner caught on fire. The difference now was that not only was our house flooded, the city of Long Beach was ruined. There was no electricity, no water, no gas. All major utilities had been shut down or flooded. The city was virtually closed. 10 days before the hurricane, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. I was having surgery on November 30th, and my goal was to recover at home. The total lack of communication was the most difficult part. City Hall was locked. By chance, I pushed my way into a press conference with Governor Cuomo and asked how we could get information, and he told me to go online. My response was, we have no electricity, no internet, no cell phones. How are we supposed to go online? Our electricity was turned on November 27th. We moved home November 28th, and my surgery was November 30th. I am cancer-free, and our home is repaired. There have always been hurricanes, but the extreme weather that is happening all over the country makes you question what is going on. In 2010, a close friend of mine in Moorhead, Minnesota, sold her house to the government after the Red River flooded her home, and there was no way to prevent it from happening again. We have vacationed in Loveland, Colorado on the Thompson River for 5 summers, but watching the news this week, one of our favorite places is now washed away. FEMA will bankrupt the government if it continues to pay for all of the destruction. The city of Long Beach is trying to figure out how to protect itself from another Sandy. But if we do not do something drastic to stop climate change at a higher level, no place will be safe to live. I am not an expert, but why not use the power of the weather here and use solar power for streetlights? There is 1 wind turbine at the end of the island. Why not 50? I always knew about climate change, but you do not really take it seriously until it happens to you. People need to understand that climate change is not a cliche, but a reality that is causing damage and destruction around the world, and we need to change the way we live to prevent future damage to our country.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kravitz. It's happening now. It's not something in the future, and it's a reality, and all of you are telling us about that reality. I want to acknowledge the presence of Congressman Lowenthal from Long Beach, California, ironically enough. But he is a very important member of the Congress and solidly behind efforts to do something about climate change. Reverend Edwards.
Thank you for, can you hear me? Thank you for inviting me here, and the group from Climate Nexus and others who made this possible for me being here. I am from Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana, which some people have called the end of the earth. It is the southeast end of Louisiana. It is where the mighty Mississippi River ends and connects to the Gulf of Mexico. We see Plaquemine Parish as a peninsula because it is surrounded by water. There's water everywhere. We have shallow lakes, we have canals, we have bayous that all connect to the Gulf of Mexico. We think that because of our proximity to the Gulf of Mexico, it makes us the gateway to most hurricanes that come to the United States. In my 61 years of living, I can't count the many of hurricanes that we had to evacuate from because of the Gulf of Mexico. Living in Plaquemine Parish means dealing with hurricane as a way of life. I was 13 years of age when a hurricane named Bessie came to Plaquemine Parish and destroyed the southeast west bank of Plaquemine Parish and tore the roof of most of the houses in the east bank where I live at. Well, again, Hurricane Katrina came. I was 53 years of age, and I had a son who was 13, and we see this total destruction of over 15 communities in Plaquemine, and the whole southeast and the Gulf Coast area were destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. Now, my mother is 88 years of age, and I have many elderly people in our community and our church who could not understand unusual weather, as most of my colleagues speaking here have been talking about. And they have been questioning it for many years. Most of them say, well, maybe it's due to exploratory and space causing it to happen. But it wasn't until after Hurricane Katrina that I began to get involved with coastal restoration, and I began to pay attention to climate change, that I began to understand the unusual weather condition that was taking place. And I'm so glad I have Dr. Knowles, so I'm not going to get into scientific stuff because I don't have enough experience yet to talk about a greenhouse gas emission and all those other technical stuff. But I can say that I'm an expert to talk about sea level rising. And that's the part that I want to talk about, because we have seen sea level rising. They talk about New Orleans being below sea level. Well, if we in Plaquemine Parish and we below New Orleans, I guess we underwater. You know, and I say this to not to be facetious, but we see enormous amount of water. You know, I'm looking at the enormous amount of land loss that's taking place in Plaquemine Parish over the years. And because of my ignorance to coastal restoration and climate change, we have started a program with young kids from ages 4 and up called Connecting Children to the Environment, so they can understand coastal restoration and climate change and be better steward of the environment than we are and a lot of members of Congress are. You know, and I think that is really important unto us. And so we found out that climate change will guarantee us more frequent and intense hurricane and storm event because of warm ocean water. So we're concerned about that because we're a very vulnerable community, and then also because we don't have a lot of things to offer like most communities. We are a very rural community, so we are very vulnerable. But South Louisiana and the Gulf Coast can expect major areas of our community to side below sea level as much as 70%, 72% by 2020, according to several scientific predicaments. While I am not adequate, as I said, to talk about greenhouse gas emission, I'm a living witness to rapid, steady sea loss. We must all see the impact of climate change. We all see it when we look at what's happening in Boulder, Colorado, the enormous amount of water and the stuff that's happening. We also look at the enormous amount of sinkholes that are taking place in Louisiana and Alabama and Florida and others. These are signs that we need to look at. Also, the accelerating melting of Arctic sea ice and the retreat of overwhelming majority of glacier worldwide are there for all of us to see. Now, I hate what the gentleman that was earlier stated that how Congress, people who getting donation for oil industry, we hope that they will change their look at, because climate change, I would say to you gentlemen, is nonpartisan. It's not based on race. It's not based on religious affiliation, political party, or sexual orientation. It is a cause that all human beings must be involved in now. It would be a shame. It would be a shameful commentary on all of our history to say that we didn't do anything. We were in a position to do so. It's time now that the whole beloved community get involved with climate change, so that human beings behind us, generation behind us, will have a safer place to live in. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. I can only say to you, Reverend, amen to your last statement. Dr. Diffenbaugh?
Thank you for the invitation to appear today. My name's Noah Diffenbaugh. I'm an associate professor and senior fellow at Stanford University. My research group studies Earth's climate, including how global warming influences extreme weather events. I'm an editor of the journal Geophysical Research Letters and a lead author for the IPCC. I'd like to address a few main questions today. Has global warming stopped? No. Does the warming trend over the last few years mean that the climate models are wrong? No. Have extremes been increasing? Yes. Extremes of high temperature, heavy rainfall, and sea level have been increasing. Is there evidence that climate change played a role in recent extremes like Superstorm Sandy or the extreme heat in the US in 2012? Yes. The evidence indicates that climate change has increased the odds of these events. First, it is important to understand that the fundamentals of Earth's energy balance, including the importance of greenhouse gases, have been understood for more than a century. In fact, without greenhouse gases, Earth's surface temperature would be colder than the freezing point of water. So although greenhouse gases make up only a very small percentage of the atmosphere, they are critical for life as we know it. However, we know from direct observations that the concentration of a number of greenhouse gases has been increasing. For example, measurements of the atmosphere and ice cores show that atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased 80 parts per million since the late 1950s, reaching levels that Earth hasn't seen in the last 800,000 years. Measurements also show that the primary cause of the increase in carbon dioxide is the burning of fossil fuels. It is also important to understand that global warming is an observation that results from many measurements, not only at the surface of the Earth, but also in the atmosphere, in the ocean, and from space. These observations show that the global average surface temperature has increased approximately 0.9 degrees Celsius since the beginning of the 20th century. Many independent scientific studies have demonstrated that this warming is not consistent with the natural variations of the climate system, nor with variations in solar output, but that it is consistent with human emissions of greenhouse gases. Observations also show that global temperature has varied from year to year and decade to decade within this overall warming trend. The recorded temperature over the most recent decade and a half falls within the range of these variations. In addition, the temperatures of the recent period are also consistent with climate model simulations, which exhibit decadal periods of zero or negative temperature trends within periods of longer-term warming. In addition to global temperatures, the frequency and/or severity of a number of types of extreme events have been observed to have increased in recent decades, and scientists have developed an understanding of the influence of global warming on the likelihood of many of these types of events. The weather that we experience on a day-to-day, season-to-season, and year-to-year basis is a result of the balance of energy entering and exiting the Earth's atmosphere and ocean. Therefore, as greenhouse gas concentrations increase, we might expect some intensification of the processes that lead to extreme weather events. A number of studies have been published in recent years reporting that the observed trends in some kinds of extremes are not consistent with natural variations, but are consistent with human-caused global warming. This is particularly true for observed increases in hot days and heavy rainfall. Rare events such as Superstorm Sandy or the heat and drought that covered much of the United States in 2012 pose particular scientific challenges. However, by focusing on the possible influences of global warming on the likelihood of rare events, the scientific community is making important progress. For example, a collection of papers focused on the high-impact extreme events of 2012 was published earlier this month. I would like to briefly highlight a few results from those studies. My co-author and I found that the extreme summer heat that occurred over the north central and northeastern U.S. is approximately 4 times as likely in the current climate as in the pre-industrial climate. Another study reported that long-term warming has increased the risk of the extremely warm spring conditions that occurred over the eastern U.S. by a factor of 10. A third study reported that sea level rise has increased the likelihood of inundation like that which occurred during Sandy by a factor of almost 2. I thank the other witnesses for sharing their personal stories about the impacts of extreme weather events on their lives. Although the climate system is noisy, and this noise is the immediate cause of all weather events, the studies that I have described demonstrate that global warming has already increased the risk of at least some of the most high-impact extreme weather events. In addition, a large body of evidence suggests that the risk of these kinds of extremes is likely to further increase if global warming continues in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diffenbaugh. I want to first recognize Mr. Moran for any questions or comments he wishes to make. And put on your mic.
Yeah, I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'm just kind of digesting what you've told us, and I'm very appreciative for you spending this time with us and alerting us. We've had any number of what they call legislative riders on the appropriations bill, particularly since we don't seem to be able to pass any authorizing legislation, but we do have to keep the government funded, presumably. There were 31 of them. A number of them dealt with coal ash, with other forms of emissions getting into the environment. Methane, for example, methane from cows that's not anything we're ever going to be able to regulate, but it's a serious source. We're particularly concerned about methane, incidentally, being emitted from the melting of the global ice caps in the Arctic, because it's all methane under that ice, apparently, and that's even causes more extreme damage to our atmosphere. What I'd like to ask, is there low-hanging fruit that the Congress could be doing now? What would have the greatest impact if we took action? Obviously, what you're telling us is cause for immediate concern. It should be in the forefront of our legislative agenda, but it's not. But are there things that we could do, for example, I guess I'm asking, where can we get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of legislation or regulation? And I guess I'll ask Dr. Diffenbaugh initially.
So there are two areas where there's potential action, and these fall in adaptation domain and in the mitigation domain. So there's a lot of scientific evidence that's emerging in the last few years that the global warming that has already occurred has changed the risk of extreme events. And it's clear from the stories that we've heard today, the firsthand accounts, as well as from the total damages of recent extreme events, that we're not, as a society, optimally adapted to the climate that we have now. We experience tremendous stress from the environment. And so as the risks have changed with the global warming that's already occurred, there are a lot of opportunities for adaptation to the climate change that has already occurred that can help to lower the impacts of extreme events in the current climate. In the mitigation domain, which is has to do with changing the trajectory of increases in greenhouse gas concentrations, there are low-hanging fruit in terms of the different atmospheric constituents. So there's been a lot of work highlighting the non-carbon dioxide species of the atmosphere that potentially can help to create a pathway towards that 2 degrees C target. So identifying methane and other short-lived species potentially is low-hanging fruit. There's also been a lot of work to try to understand how the world could get to that 2 degrees C target. And it is true that it's possible still to achieve that 2 degrees C target. It would require aggressive decarbonization of the economy. I'm not here to advocate for one policy or the other, but there is still a window in which that 2 degrees C target could be achieved with a change in the energy mix globally in terms of the energy that's used to fuel the global economy.
Well, that 2 degrees Celsius increase even of itself is going to mean that extreme weather events are going to be the new norm, but you're saying that's about the best we could hope for, and even that is dependent upon us taking aggressive action. And as you say, kind of decarbonizing the environment by decarbonizing the economy. But we're seeing more and more extraction of natural gas, for example, by fracking, but that's carbon-based. Oil and gas is not letting up. We're seeing more and more oil and gas drilling up in Montana and the Dakotas and so on, Idaho. I guess I'd like to ask Mr. Fitzsimmons, what have you thought about in terms of legislation? What do you want, ideally, what would you want us to do as a result of your coming up here from Texas and sharing your experience with us?
First of all, thank you for asking. Everybody's drunk by money. A fire hose of money has been turned on to our county, and people are blinded by it. But I would imagine if I really had a wish list, it would be for serious regulation by the Railroad Commission, which runs our oil and gas division in the state of Texas.
The Railroad Commission?
It's called the Railroad Commission because the railroads got there before the oil and gas did, but they've never renamed it. So it's chugging along.
And it's the same pockets that are being filled.
Yes, sir. I think what is for me personally, the seminal moment came for me when I went before the examiner and the judge to protest this particular disposal well that was injecting frac fluids, and they looked at me and said, "It's hearsay. You cannot even ask the question. And it was a deer in the headlights moment for me. I just could not believe what I was hearing, but I think it was instructive also because it just showed me what a powerful commission this was that was not willing to look at the reality of it, which we are losing our water. Our water is being taken from us because what one man does affects your neighbor when you're dealing with underground water. But something that could be done would be recycling. They could recycle the water. They'll get 20% flow back. They can recycle that 20% and they can use it on the next frack job rather than taking out more water to do the next job. So that's actually something that could be done. But unfortunately, the state of Texas does not mandate recycling the water. Also, a lot of landowners are getting rich by selling water. So this is something that is an ongoing problem, but unfortunately, we're up against human nature and greed, and it's something that keeps me awake at night, but I'm trying to move forward with it, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzsimmons. Mr. Chairman, I just, this will be the last, but given the fact that we have the farm bill that's been pending, let me ask our farmer from Iowa, have you thought of any low-hanging fruit that we could pick and moving forward somewhat on this issue?
Well, I think the low-hanging fruit is fairly obvious with very little budget costs. But politically, it probably isn't low-hanging fruit. But the low-hanging fruit is that Congress would lead on this, is that Congress would ask the American people, say, not deny the science, but depend on our scientists, and lead the American people, and then lead the world in solving this problem. That's the low-hanging fruit. It doesn't cost Congress anything to do that. And to ask the farmers to say, look, you can have a role in this, instead of telling farmers, politically organizing them to kind of be part of the denial, is to lead and say, we can solve this problem for the world. We're going to lead. That would be the low-hanging fruit. That's the easy thing to do in terms of just common sense. I understand the politics of that. And then when you get into the Farm Bill, certainly there are, and that's a really complicated subject, but there are some specific things that can happen out on the farm. And they are happening, but again, they're happening kind of on the edges as opposed to happening in the mainstream. So cover crops is one of them. I mean, farmers developed the idea of cover crops. Grazing systems, farmers developed that. Agribusiness didn't. They came around and now sell inputs for the grazing systems. Cover crops the same way. Agribusiness is going to come around to selling the inputs for cover crops, but it's the farmers themselves. So low-hanging fruit is that we say, the leadership in Congress would say, we're going to fund innovation, we're going to fund farmers, we're going to fund public institutions to do the research to find the solutions to this. That's not necessarily a specific thing to put in the Farm Bill, but it's more an attitudinal approach that is really missing and could be very helpful.
Well, thank you, Mr. Russell. Of course, as Mr. Waxman, Mr. Lowenthal know, that some of our colleagues are, it would cost them to join this effort to with regard to climate change. It's $34 million in campaign contributions, for example, that are coming from the oil and gas industry every year. But you all have made a compelling case. Thanks for the opportunity to have this hearing, Mr. Chairman. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Mr. Lowenthal, do you want to either use your time to ask questions or make any comments?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing and for inviting me. I found it very interesting. I apologize for coming a little late. But I'm struck with a couple of things, and one of the things kind of generally is the feeling of the implication that, well, these are difficult times, and so the costs, we can't deal with a lot of these issues, so we engage in denial of some of the real problems and some. But we really do not deal with the fact that the longer we wait to deal with climate change, the more it's going to cost. And so it's kind of penny wise and pound foolish. And I start with asking a question that I think is, to me, very important for my district regarding climate change. But I'm not just concerned with my district, and that has to do with something, Ms. Kravitz, you mentioned, well, you're from Long Beach, and I come from the other Long Beach, which is also on the ocean. And I want to talk about something that Reverend Edwards raised, and also that Dr. Diffenbach also raised. And that has to do with some of the costs, and some of the things that really worry me is that besides the extreme weather events that we see and then we become aware of the impacts of climate change, that my community is totally dependent upon international trade. Long Beach is part of the global economy. We move between LA and Long Beach, about 40% of the nation's goods go in and out. We've built a phenomenal infrastructure now, but that infrastructure was based upon, in both ports, where sea level is today. And both Reverend Edwards mentioned also about the rise in sea level, and I think so did Dr. Diffenbach. I'm very concerned about that. I've heard estimates that sea level on the Pacific could go anywhere between by the end of the century, 2 and 7 feet rise in sea level, which would have just a tremendous impact upon our infrastructure that we've developed. And I'm just wondering, how do we figure that in? How, we're going to be having to replace, you talked about adaptation, phenomenal sums of money if we don't deal with this. Is there a way in which we can deal with some of these issues, and what really are the implications? I think we're in massive denial about this. This is going to be costs of such a staggering nature. It's not just those specific environmental events, which are tremendously impactful, as you've all mentioned, but I'm talking about underlying this. We're going to see impacts across the nation that are just so staggering in the costs. And how do we include this in, how do we estimate what some of these costs are? I can just see in my community alone, we're going to have to replace half the ports.
So this is a very current question, including at my institution at Stanford, where there's been work on this exact question of sea level rise and ports. So I would encourage you to look at the work and potentially get in touch with Professors Martin Fisher and Pam Matson and their graduate student who just finished a dissertation on this topic, Austin Becker. And I think the topic of today's forum on extremes is very, very relevant, because when we see those numbers of historical sea level rise or of projected sea level rise, those are the mean sea level rise. But it really is the extremes that have the impact, and we saw this very clearly with Superstorm Sandy, where that inundation occurs when there is an extreme event that causes the existing infrastructure to be insufficient. And as you say, we've built, for the most part as a society, we've built our infrastructure based on our historical experience. And now, because of climate change, for many of these extreme events, we're moving into what some call a new normal. We're certainly moving into a period where many types of extremes are already more frequent. And for infrastructure like ports that are, as you've noted, so critical for the economy of the country, it's not necessarily how the mean changes, it's how often do we experience extremes that exceed our current adaptation. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities, and again, this dissertation that was recently completed at Stanford identified opportunities for ports in particular within the context of sea level rise.
Thank you. I will follow up on that.
I think what's important is that there's a part of our community, Hurricane Isaac, took place 7 years to the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and they got lost in the wilderness because of Sandy. But I would tell you today that we have over 400-some people who are displaced because of Hurricane Isaac. But the unique thing about Hurricane Isaac, it was in an area that have never, ever received any water whatsoever. It is where most people who's evacuating from my community left their cars. And there was stuff that you saw on the news where they was coming getting people out of helicopter. Never happened, but it happened. And so it's very important, and with Representative Waxman, we need some David in the Congress. You know, we need some Caleb and Joshua in the Congress who willing to take on the oil industry and saying what you're doing to humanity is wrong. We have to challenge representatives, because if we don't, the future generations in trouble. People are afraid. Now, let me tell you, if you look at these holes that are taking place, these big holes, and he's a scientist, but just some little stuff, a little country boy, but there's some cabins underwater. I'm saying that because of water keeps everything that takes place, climate change, loosen up a lot of stuff, and you get all the bubbling of water taking place, these holes taking place all over the country. So I'm saying it's time now that people get beyond the oil industry and get beyond the Corps of Engineers and these institutions that we have that nobody want to touch because the amount of money they donate to people, to represent it. We're saying we need some congressmen who are willing to take the stand and saying, look, coastal restoration got to be like John crying in the wilderness. You got to cry this out loud. And we think that if we get more congressional members able to go against the grain, you'll find that support from the community come loud. We know people used to tell us, why do y'all still live in hurricane? Why do y'all live in it? But then look what happened with Sandy. Look what happened. Instead of getting flooded water along the beach there, the Broadwalk was sand, the same way as our water is. We're saying, look what's happening all over the country now. We're saying it's now that we get some Goliaths and Caleb's in the Congress to make climate change the top priority. Because if not, humanity would not be the same.
Thank you very much for that eloquent testimony.
Thank you very much. This panel is the first time that we've heard from people who can talk from their own experience about what climate change, extreme weather events means to them, what they've seen in their own lives. And the stories that you're telling us, whether it's about a flood or a drought or some other weather event, that is extreme, it used to be once in a while. Now it's happening more and more often and with greater intensity. So I think it's important that we hear about it from people that are affected. When our committee hears from the Environmental Protection Agency tomorrow, the head of the EPA is going to testify, and she's going to talk about regulations that she's going to propose to limit the amount of pollution that comes from coal-burning power plants. That's one of the major reasons we have greenhouse gases. She's going to hear from a lot of people who are going to say, why should we undertake the costs of doing these things? But she has to do an evaluation of costs and benefits before she makes any proposal. I think you illustrate that there's a cost for doing nothing, and that cost is an unbearable cost. She will also talk about, and I think others need to talk about, the benefits. Not only the benefits to avoid these types of climate change, but I think the benefits for our economy we've seen from environmental legislation. I was involved in the adoption of the Clean Air Law. We heard all these claims that it's going to cost too much and it's going to ruin our economy. But in developing technology, it has been a huge boost to our economy. More jobs, Americans out front in the development of a lot of these anti-pollution devices, and new ways of, as farmers pioneered, new ways of avoiding environmental damage. We knew in the 30s what happened to farmers that didn't know that without rotating crops and other things, the benefits of, that would lead to greater productivity on the farms. Members of Congress are going to try to stop EPA from calculating the benefits associated with curbing carbon pollution, but in effect what they're saying, for whatever reason they're saying it, they're saying that climate change doesn't cost us anything. But they should be hearing from you. There's enormous costs, financial and human, to the consequences of doing nothing about climate change. That's why I'm very proud of President Obama. Maybe he's the David that we've been yearning for. He sometimes talks about being in the Joshua generation. He's looked at the Congress and said, if you don't act, he said he will act. And luckily, we have a lot of laws on the books that give the president an enormous amount of authority to take the clean air law and regulate the pollution, or to take the Department of Energy and make sure that we are not using energy and wasting it. We can be more efficient. And we need to look at adaptation, because climate change is going to happen. It's happening now, and it's not going to stop, even if we try to prevent the damage in the future. Dr. Diefenbach, as I understand it, these pollutants go in the air, but they stay there. And so when we add more carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases, it's not the first time, it's being added to all that which is there. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. For any of the greenhouse gases or other what scientists call radiatively active species, so the parts of the constituents of the atmosphere that affect the how much energy is going into the climate system.
Well, I just keep on thinking about what a person who was very wise said to me. If you don't accept what the scientists have to say, think about the idea that there's a 10% chance that the scientists are right, that this climate change issue is going to get out of control, that we can't reverse it if you add too much more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And we only live with one atmosphere in this planet, and we all share it. And think about a 10% chance of destroying it. That to me brings home the point that I think we all agree upon. So your being here today means an enormous amount of good. It's helpful. I wish the whole committee could have heard you, but I'm going to certainly talk about it tomorrow. I don't always ascribe the worst motives to people. It's not just that they got campaign contributions. People are fearful of change. And when somebody is in the coal areas of our country or the oil-producing areas of the country, they're worried about the impact on their economy. What we need to explain is we're going to still need oil and coal, but we've got to start a transition in our economy to using less of it. And a lot of those same areas will get new industries. I was interested in what you had to say, Mr. Fitzsimmons, about how in Texas, the oil and gas people are experiencing an enormous financial boost right now, but there are a lot of other people in Texas that are seeing those changes detrimental to them. Well, we need to make changes and make them where we're boosting our economy, giving people jobs, and telling farmers, don't think that this is all made up. This is the kind of thing that farmers have always led the way in trying to make sure that we can protect agriculture and our country's future. Unless any of my colleagues want to make any other comments? Yep, Mr. Lowenthal.
I just would like to highlight something that you've said. Not only is it wonderful to hear about something from the panelists about the impacts upon their lives of extreme weather and climate change, but, Mr. Chair, something that you've said I think also needs to be highlighted, and that is we can have economic development and protect our communities and reduce the carbon-based footprint that we have and promote the well-being of our communities. There are lots of models that are out there that promote economic development. I just think, as I mentioned before, I remember when the ports, and I worked on this issue, and so did many others, and then when we said you have to reduce your carbon footprint, you have to have green ports, they said you cannot have economic development and clean ports. We're going to lose our business. Well, they have changed their business model. They now have reduced their carbon footprint, and they've increased their business. So I think that we have to highlight this is economically vitally important for the nation to move in this direction, and I thank you for raising
Well, I thank you for making that point. That's a good point to close on. I think this has been a very helpful hearing, and I thank everybody for your participation. We stand adjourned.